Our story is a Scandinavian one. And you know those are always good stories. Once upon a time, there was a farmer who had 3 sons. The oldest one was called Peter, and the next one was called Paul, and the youngest one was called Boots. All he ever did was shine the shoes for the family, and because he never had much to say, they thought he was a fool. Well, one day, the father called his sons to him, and he said, "You are now grown to be young men, and I must tell you that this farm is too small to support all of us. To tell you the truth, I haven't 1 copper in my pocket to rub against another, and the time has come when you must go out into the world and find your own fortune." And as they were going along the road, Peter said to Paul, because he was paying no attention to Boots at all, "You know, I've heard that the king in the next country has a problem that he can't solve. There's a tremendous oak tree that grows outside his palace, and it is so large that it darkens the whole palace. And also his palace is built on such a high hill that he can't get a well dug. He's promised great rewards to anyone who will help him. Why don't we go there and see?" And Boots said, "I think that's a fine idea." Peter laughed at him and he said, "Your approval is enough to make me change my plans, but we'll go." Now on the way, they had to go through a little forest. And they were just about into the forest when they heard a noise. And Boots said, "I wonder what's making that noise." And Peter said, "Isn't it true that you're the fool of the family? You wouldn't recognize the noise of an axe chopping a tree? What else would you expect to hear in a forest?" Boots said, "I'm going to go and see what it is." And they laughed at him, and he left them, went up in amongst the trees. He found an axe chopping all by itself. And he stood there in amazement, and finally he said, "Is this what you do? Chop and hew all by yourself?" And the axe said, "Yes, this is what I do, waiting for you. I've been waiting for you for years." And Boots said, "Good. I need a good axe." So he took the axe and he pulled the haft out of it, put the 2 pieces into his knapsack, and went back to his brothers. And they said, "Well, booby, what did you find?" He said, "Oh, it was an axe we heard. You were right." And they went on. After a while, they heard another noise. And Boots said, "I wonder what that is." And Paul said, "Oh, you booby. Haven't you ever been in the forest before? Did you ever hear a woodpecker? That's what that is." Boots said, "Well, I'm going to go see anyway." So off he went. And he heard his brothers laughing at him and calling him a fool, but he went on. And when he was deep in the forest, he saw a spade digging and delving all by itself in amongst the trees. He stood looking at it for a while, and he never saw a spade move so fast. And he said, "Is this what you do, all by yourself?" And the spade said, "Yes, this is what I do, waiting for you. I've been digging and delving here for years, waiting for you to come along." And Boots said, "Good." So he took the spade and he pulled the handle out of it, and he put the 2 pieces into his knapsack and went back to his brothers. And Paul said to him, "Well, booby, what did you find?" Boots said, "Well, it wasn't a woodpecker. It was a spade I heard." Paul said, "That certainly is an unusual thing. I'm sure that that was a great wonderment to you." And they walked on. Well, they were tired and thirsty, and they came to a little stream and sat down beside it to rest. And they drank some of the clear water. And Boots said, "I wonder where this stream comes from." And his brothers hooted at him. They said, "You and your wondering. It's a wonder you have any brain in your head at all. Don't you know that water comes out of a hole in the ground that they call a spring?" Boots said, "No, I think I'll just go see." So he started to follow the little stream, and it grew smaller and smaller and smaller. until finally he came to the source of it. And it was just a wee trickle of water that happened to be coming through an old walnut lying on some moss. And Boots said, "Oh, is this what you do? Just trickle here all by yourself?" And the stream said, "Yes, this is what I do. I've been waiting for you. For years and years I've been waiting for you." And Boots said, "Well, I never thought of that. But you never know when you'll need a drink of water, so I'll take you along." And he picked up the walnut and sealed the hole in it with a bit of moss and put it into his knapsack and went back to his brothers. And of course they said, "Well, Booby, what did you find?" And he said, "Well, you were right. It was water coming out of a hole in the ground." They were disgusted with him. They wouldn't talk to him. And they started off again. Well, at long last, they came to the next kingdom. And they could see the king's castle away high on the hill. They were walking along the street of the town. And they met a man who asked them where they were going. And they said, "Oh, we're going up to the king's castle to try our fortune at cutting down the oak tree and digging him a well." The man said, "I wouldn't advise you to try. This very strange thing about that oak tree, you cut one chip off it, and 2 chips grow in its place. And so many men have tried to cut it down since the king offered a reward, that now it has grown out of all reason, and the whole castle is shaded by it." Well, they have to use lights inside the castle, even in the brightest sunshine. And as for the well, many, many people have tried to dig a well. They dig down for about 6 inches, and then they strike living rock. Who can dig a well in that kind of material? The brothers said, "Well, we came to try, and we should try." The man said, "You'd better not. The king says that he has had so many disappointments, that the oak tree has grown so large, that the next person who tries and fails is going to have his ears notched and be put on a desert island." And Peter said, "Well, we came to try, and I don't want to go home without having done it." So off they trudged up the high hill. They went to the king, and he warned them. He said, "I must tell you that if you fail, I'll maroon you on a desert island, and I will dock your ears too." But Peter insisted, "I've chopped wood all my life." He went out to the great tree, and he picked up an axe that was there. And he took a chop at the tree and knocked 1 chip off, and immediately 2 grew in its place. The king was watching, and he said to his soldiers, "Stop him! Seize him before that tree grows any bigger." And they took Peter. And Paul said, "Wait a minute, let me try before you do anything to him." And he picked up the axe. And he went over to the tree and chopped at it. And again, he knocked 1 chip off it, and 2 grew in its place. And the king said, "Seize him too." And Boots said, "Wait, let me try." And the soldiers laughed at him. They said, "Let us notch your ears now, save you some trouble." But no, Boots reached into his knapsack, and he took the axe, and he put the haft into the head of it. And he threw it at the tree, and the axe began to chop all by itself, so fast that you couldn't see it moving, so fast that it cut the tree down before the chips could grow back, and the great oak fell and went tumbling down the hill into the river. The king was astounded, and he said, "Now, if you can dig me a well that will hold water for a year, not only will I give you a reward, but you may marry the princess and be king when I die." Boots reached into his knapsack, and he took out the spade. And he put the handle into it, and he set it to dig by itself. It moved so fast that when it did strike the rock under the thin layer of topsoil, it kept going. And before long, it had a great hole dug. And Boots went down into the hole, and when he got down there, he took the walnut out of his knapsack and removed the plug of moss and put it in a corner and said, "There now, little stream, run and trickle as you did for years in the forest." And the water began to trickle through the walnut, and Boots, as the water got deeper and deeper and deeper, swam on the top of it until he was at the top of the well and could climb out. Of course, he was soaking wet, but the king didn't care. He rushed up to him and embraced him. He was so glad to have water and light in his castle. And he said, "You are the man I've been waiting for to deliver me from these troubles. And you are the man who will marry my daughter, and you will be king after me." Boots said, "That's all very well. But before I say yes, make your soldiers release my brothers. I don't want them put on a desert island. I don't want their ears docked." And the king agreed. And he called in everyone in his kingdom for a wedding feast that lasted 9 nights and 8 days. And I'll tell you, I was there. And the 9th night was as gay as the first. And Boots and his brothers sent for their father, and they came to live with them, and they all lived happily ever after. Once upon a time, there was a man who had 3 sons. The names were Peter and Paul, and the youngest one they called Boots, because he never did very much. He'd sit by the fire, and he'd shine all the shoes in the house, and they thought he was a fool. Well, one day the father said to them, "I don't know what it is at all that's eating all the hay in my big field. But every year on St. John's Eve, just when it's ready to harvest, something comes and destroys that field. And Peter, I want you to go out tonight and see what it is that's destroying my wealth. There's a good barn up there. You can sleep in that." So Peter went up to the field, and he lay down in the barn and went to sleep. And along in the dark of the middle of the night, he was wakened by a tremendous earthquake crashing around him. And he got up, and he was going to go out and see what it was, when another one happened. And he took to his heels and ran off home with himself, and he didn't know anything at all. He was that frightened. And in the morning, his father went up to the field, and lo and behold you, the hay was gone. Well, he plowed the field again, and he planted it. And the next year, when it was ready to harvest, he said to Paul, "This year you will see. You will guard my field and see what it is that destroys my crop." And Paul was very brave, you know. He said, "Oh, yes, certainly, that Peter is as foolish as Boots. I'll do it." So, on the night, he went up to the barn, and he barricaded the door, and he felt very secure until there came a great crashing and rumbling and a flashing of lightning in the sky, and it frightened him. He didn't wait for the second one at all. He took out, he went home. Well, his father was very much distressed, and he was saying, "What am I going to do? Here I am, an old man, and the 2 sons who think they're so smart can do nothing. Do I have to go up there and see what it is myself?" And Boots said, "No. When the time comes, I'll go." And they roared laughing. They thought that was the funniest thing they'd ever heard, that Boots would think he could do it. But on the next St. John's Eve, Boots was ready, and off he went. And he took nothing with him but a flint and steel in his tinderbox. And his father said, "Well, don't you want to take one of your brothers?" And he said, "No, indeed. If it's magic that's bothering it, the steel in my tinderbox is good protection against any magic." So off he went, and he went up to the barn, and he didn't bother to barricade the door. He left it open to see what would happen. He wanted a good view. And the hay was a fine high stand of hay. So he was sitting there in the dark, and along about midnight, there came a great flashing of lightning in the sky and a rumbling of an earthquake, and it shook him a bit. And he said, "Well, Peter said there were 2 of them. I'll wait now." And it wasn't very long before the second one came along, and that really shook him. It knocked him down. And he said, "Well, things like this happen in threes. I'd better wait."
And he lay there on the barn floor where he'd been knocked down, and there came such a shaking and rumbling that the barn just rocked. When he came to himself, he looked out the door, and there in the field was the most tremendous black horse he had ever seen. And lying beside it, in the hay, was a full suit of armor made of brass. And the horse was breathing fire. And Boots said, "Well, indeed, I never saw such a horse in the world." So he took the steel from his tinderbox, and he threw it over the horse's back. And steel, of course, will put any magic creature under a spell, and the horse couldn't move. So Boots went over, and he picked up the armor and put it up on the horse's back, and he got up on the horse's back himself, and he rode it away to a cave that he knew, and hid it. And the next morning, when he turned up at the house, his brothers were teasing him and saying, "You were so frightened you couldn't move in the night, weren't you? You couldn't get home." And he said, "Oh, no, I was not. I slept like a baby." And they said, "How's the hay?" And he said, "Oh, it's fine. You should see it. It's ready to harvest." And they went up to the field, and lo and behold, there it stood, as high and as fresh and as wonderful as ever. Well, the father was surprised, and he was very much pleased too. And he said, "Well, we'll plant this field again, and we'll give Boots the job of taking care of it." And the next year, when the field was ready to harvest, Boots went up again, and he knew pretty well what was coming at him. So he waited for the 3 earthquakes, and then he looked out, and here was a great white horse getting ready to burn up the hay with the fire he was breathing from his nostrils. And next to him in the hay was a suit of silver armor. Well, Boots took his steel and flipped it over his back, and the horse couldn't move. And Boots went out and gathered up the armor, put it on the horse's back, and got up himself and took it off to the cave with the black horse and kept it there. And he said nothing to any of his brothers about it. And he thought, well, these things happen in threes. So he waited and kept his own counsel till the next year, when he was sent up again to take care of the field, and behold you, another black horse appeared after the 3 earthquakes. And this time there was an armor of gold with him. And Boots again put him under his power with a piece of steel and took him away to the cave with his other 2 horses. Well, now it happened that the king of that country had a beautiful daughter. And in some way or another he had drawn down on himself the ire of the trolls. And they had transported his daughter to the top of a glass hill, and no one could get near her. And the king said that anyone who could ride up that hill and rescue his daughter could marry her. Well, there she sat at the top of the glass hill in plain sight of everybody, and she was playing with 3 golden apples that she had had in her lap the day she was taken away. And the king called all the princes and the brave men and the knights in the countryside to come to see could they rescue her. And there was a great day of festivity. And Peter and Paul went, and they watched all these knights riding at the hill. And sure, a horse would put one hoof on the hill and he'd slip down again. He couldn't get anywhere. He could get no footing at all. Well, after they were all tired out with trying, the king was about to call it a day, when off in the distance they saw a brightness coming toward them. And as it came close, they saw that it was a great black horse, and on his back was a knight fully accoutred in brass. And as he rode up, the other knight said to him, "Don't try it. It's impossible. You'll break your horse's legs." But the brass-clad knight didn't pay any attention to them at all. He took his horse way down to the end of the field, and he ran up that hill as hard as he could. And when the horse hit the hill, he went 1/3 of the way up, when the knight just turned him as though he were on a flat field and rode down again. Well, the princess had risen from her chair when she saw him making some progress, and she rolled one of the golden apples down toward him, and he caught it in the greave of his armor and rode away. Oh, there was a great to-do. Who was this mysterious knight? And when Peter and Paul got home, it was all they could talk about. And they said to Boots, "Look at you, sitting here with your feet in the ashes, doing nothing, and you could have been out there in all that excitement. You should have seen that man. There never was such a horseman in the world." Boots says, "I've seen better." Well, the next day they were going to try again. And the king said, "I'm sick of these knights and these princes. They can do nothing. I'll give my daughter to anyone who can rescue her." Well, then Peter and Paul decided they wanted to try. And they went off, and they got the plough horses, thinking that their big feet would be fine on this glass hill, but they could do nothing any more than the princes and the knights could do. And everyone was about to give up in despair when they looked toward the sun and it dropping in the sky, and they saw someone riding toward them. And as he came near, they saw that it was a knight clad in silver, riding a white horse and wearing a great plume in his hat. And they tried to dissuade him. They said, "Don't do it. You'll break your horse's legs." And he made an impatient sign with his hands and said nothing. But he went way down to the end of the field, and he galloped as hard as he could, and he put his horse at the hill, and up he went, 2/3 of the way. And then he just pivoted the horse like a dancer on his hind legs and started down the hill again. And the princess had jumped up. She thought she was going to be rescued at last, and she rolled a second apple down the hill. And the knight just leaned from his horse, and he caught it in the cuff of his gauntlet and rode off. He wouldn't stop to talk to anyone. Well, when Boots' brothers got home that night, Boots was sitting by the fire, and they began to berate him for a fool, that he was missing everything. "You should have seen the horseman that came today. He was better than the fellow yesterday. Sure, he got 2/3 of the way up the hill, and you missed it, you fool." And Boots said, "Oh, I've seen better." Well, the next day they were going to try again, and they were all out there, and they were exhausting themselves and their horses trying to get up that hill. And they couldn't even cut a foothold in the glass of it. And when they were all tired out and about to give up, they saw another knight come riding. And this fellow was so resplendent in the sunshine that they could hardly look at him. He was on a black horse, but he had gold armor. And they thought that he was quite the most splendid thing that they'd ever seen. And he paid no attention to them at all. He went down to the end of the field, and he rode all the way up the hill. And he got to the princess, and instead of taking her, he leaned over and he took the 3rd golden apple out of her lap. And then he just lifted her in one arm, and he rode down the hill, and he put her down at the foot of the hill, and he rode away, where she stood there crying. She said, "Here, I've seen 3 of the most fabulous knights in the world, and I don't know who any one of them is." And her father rushed up to her. He was delighted to have her down from that glass hill, and he said, "You stop your crying now. We'll find him. If he lives in the world at all, we'll find him." So he sent out a proclamation that he wanted to see every man who was able to ride a horse in his kingdom and in all the kingdoms surrounding his. And the man who could fulfill certain conditions could marry the princess. Well, they came in droves, and they were some of the finest horsemen in the world. As each one would go up to the king would say, "Have you the apples?" And none of them had any golden apples at all. Well, along came Boots, and he in his rags, and no horse under him. And everybody roared, laughing, fit to kill themselves as he walked up to the king. The king said, "What are you doing here?" And Boots said, "Oh, I came to bring you these." And he reached into his raggedy pocket, and he came out with the 3 golden apples. Well, the princess nearly died of chagrin. She said, "I'm not going to marry him. Look at him." And Boots reached up to the shoulder of his rags, and he ripped them down from him. And under the rags he had the gold armor. But then she was sorry. But it was too late. Boots said, "Were you marrying me or my rags? Or was it only your apples you wanted back?" And he started off, he was going to show her a thing or two, and the king called after him. And Boots came back and said, "What is it you want?" And the king said, "Don't mind her. All girls her age are full of foolish notions. And I'm sure that she'll grow up to be a woman such as her mother was. Give her another chance, won't you?" So Boots was willing, and much to his brother's and his father's amazement too, he married the princess. And when she found out that he didn't wear rags all of the time, and he really was a gentle soul, she stopped being haughty toward him. And they lived happily enough. And when Boots became the king, he was the best king they ever had in that country.
We have a story from very ancient Ireland. One early summer morning, Finn and his Fianna were on a hillside waiting for the mists to clear so that they could hunt. And Oisin, who was Finn's son and the poet of the group, was telling them about a great god who used to live there. He was the armorer to the other gods, and he made their spears and their shields and their armor. He made spears that were so fierce that they had to be set in pails of poppy seed to keep them calm. His name was Len. Well, now the mists were rising as the sun was coming up over the horizon, and they saw one bank of mist coming toward them. And suddenly it split into two pieces, and a rider on a beautiful white horse came out of it. And Finn said to his son, "Oisin, look, it looks like the god Len himself coming toward us." But as the rider came nearer, they saw that it was no god. It was a beautiful maiden. And Finn said, "Look, she must be a queen. She's wearing a crown. She looks regal." And as she came closer, they saw that she was, in truth, a queen. And she rode up in front of Finn McCool and she said, "Finn, the great leader of the Fianna, I am Niamh of the golden hair, and I'm the daughter of the king of the land of the ever young." And Finn said, "We're very glad to have you here, but tell us, why did you come?" She said, "It was the love of your son, Oisin, and his poetry that brought me. And I've come to take him back to my father's land, where he will never grow old." Well, at that, a great hush fell on the hillside, and all the men stood as though they were under a spell. And not even a bird sang, nor could they hear a bee buzzing, and the stream running down the hillside seemed to be silent. And Oisin, moving as though he were in a dream, walked toward Niamh and her horse, and when she beckoned to him, he mounted the horse behind her. She turned her steed and rode away. And the silence was broken by Finn and his men wailing and crying to Oisin not to leave them. But Oisin seemed to be in a kind of maze, and he turned and gave them a last look, and he lifted his arm and gave them a slight wave, and away he went. They came to the ocean, and the horse went right out on the crests of the waves as though he were on solid ground. Then he began to go so fast that no wind could have caught him. And they seemed to be in a very strange place. Oisin looked, and he said to Niamh, "Look what I see. I see a fine white hound with a red ear chasing a yellow deer. Let me go after her." And Niamh said, "Ah, no, Oisin, this is nothing. This is a vision. Wait till we get home to my land, and then you will have hunting." And on they went, and they came to a part of the ocean where great storms attacked them, and great torrents of rain came down. But still the white steed went so fast that they were soon through this horrible weather, and they came at last to the fairest country that Oisin had ever dreamed about in all of his poetry. And he said, "Is this it?" And Niamh said, "Yes. This is the land of the ever young, Tir na Nog." They went ashore, and the horse rode up to a magnificent castle, and they went through the gate, and there were 200 warriors lined up to greet them, 100 of them on white horses and 100 on black horses. And down between the two files was coming the king. He hurried to Oisin and welcomed him. He said, "Ah, this is the place for poets, and we are so glad you have come, because your songs will never die here, nor will you. Come down now, come and meet the queen." And Oisin came down from the horse, and Niamh came with him. And they went into the palace, and they met the queen. And she said to him, "Oisin, I have always wanted my daughter to marry a poet, and now that you're here, I suggest that you be married immediately." And so they were. And they had a great wedding feast, and the king's musicians played on silver harps in such a way that Oisin thought he must be dreaming. The next day they went hunting. Now he'd been hunting all his life, ever since he'd been able to sit up on a horse. But he never had such a hunt. This was paradise for hunters. It was that way with everything. He had only to wish for something, and it came true. While he was awake, this was fine. He was very happy. But in his sleep, he used to dream about home, and about his father, and about his father's men, and the fun that they used to have in Ireland. Sometimes he would dream so strongly that he'd wake up, and he'd be lonesome. He'd get up out of bed, and he'd pace the floor. And Niamh would waken and see him doing this, and she'd come and comfort him. And the next day, she would see to it that a fine hunt was organized. She organized one of these special hunts. And Oisin became separated from the rest of them. He found himself in a very strange place. No more beautiful green trees and grass, but only wasteland and black rocks, slippery with a kind of slime. But his horse was very clever, although he was reluctant, but he climbed these rocks. And when they came to the top of the mountain, there was a plain, and there was a horrid-looking black castle. No sign of life about the place at all. Oisin thought he heard his father's hunting horn, and he went looking for it. He went up to the castle gate, and beside the gate he saw a cave. And in the cave was a lovely maiden, chained completely and guarded by 2 eagles. She said to him, "I don't know who you are, but go away. This castle belongs to the Fomor, and he's a horrid giant. And many champions have come to try to rescue me. He's held me here prisoner for I don't know how many years, and he has killed them all. Go away before he kills you too." And Oisin said, "Ah, no. Remember, I am a member of the Fianna. I am the son of Finn McCool. I'm not afraid of any Fomorian that ever lived." And with that, he took his sword and knocked 3 great knocks on the castle gate. And the old gate swung open with a horrid screech, and out came the Fomorian. He was huge, and he had a sword in his belt, and in his hand he had a tremendous club with iron spikes in it. And he lifted the club to bring it down on Oisin's head, and Oisin skipped aside. And the Fomor came down with this speed and turned himself around. Well, of course, for such a big man, he was very slow, and he couldn't understand where this man had gone to that he was attacking. And while he was looking for him, Oisin was able to stab him with his sword. Well, they fought. They fought all day, and no one could tell who was going to be the victor. Until at last, just as the sun was going down, Oisin managed to get in a good blow with his sword, and he pierced the Fomor's shoulder. And with that, the Fomor's servants came out and rescued their master and took him back into the castle to heal him with magic unguents. Oisin fell where he was, but he wasn't there long before Niamh came in. And she said, "Ah, I have found you. Come, I will heal you." And she took him to the cave where the maiden was chained. And with magic ointments, she cured his hurts. And he opened his eyes, and he saw that one of the chains had fallen from the captive lady. The next morning he was up with the sun, and he was out beating on the Fomorian's gate again. And once more they spent the day battling. And who could tell who would be the victor? And at the end of the day, once more the giant's servants came out and rescued him. And once more Niamh came and took care of Oisin. And when he came to, after his wounds had been healed, he saw that more of the chains had fallen from the captive. The next morning when he rose, he went to the gate and knocked on it. And the giant came out, and again he had this great club. And he lifted it. This time he was sure he was going to kill Oisin. And as he lifted it, he was off balance. And Oisin was able to run in and stab him to the heart. As soon as he was dead, Oisin and Niamh went to the cave, and they found that the maiden was completely free. The chains had dropped from her entirely. She went into the Fomorians' castle and took a horse, and she said, "Now I'm going home to my own people." Well, now all of this, of course, had made Oisin forget his homesickness. And he and Niamh were riding back toward her father's country. And they had to go along the shore of a lake. Suddenly, Oisin stopped. He saw something in the water. And although Niamh called to him, come on, my father is waiting for us," he stopped. And he went down to the water because he had recognized in the driftwood that was coming up on the shore a spearhead such as the Fianna had used. He picked it up and he nearly cried over it. And when he went back to his horse and caught up with Niamh, he said, "Niamh, I'm sorry. Here is a spearhead from Ireland, and many a time have I hunted with one just like it. I must go home. If it's for only one day, I must go back and see my father." Well, she tried to dissuade him, and she said, "Don't go. Ireland isn't what you think it is. Don't go." But he insisted. He said, "I'll have to go. I'll never be happy here with you again until I have seen my father, even for one day." And she said, "Very well, if you must go, you must. I will let you take my horse, and he will take you there safely. But remember, when you get to Ireland, don't let your feet touch the earth, or you'll never come back to me." Oisin promised. And he mounted her beautiful white horse, and away he went over the ocean, riding the crests of the waves as if he were on dry land. And before he knew it, he was back in Ireland. First he went to his father's favorite hunting ground, and he could see no sign of him. There were buildings all around where once there had been nothing but a bare hill where the men rested. He noticed people, but he thought, where did these little people come from? Why, even my father's slaves were bigger men than these. So he rode up to some of them, and when they saw him, they fell flat on their faces in astonishment. They thought this was some god appearing to them. And they said, "Who are you?" And he said, "I'm Oisin. I'm the son of Finn McCool, and will you please tell me where I'll find him?" And with that, a very old man who was with them said, "Finn McCool? Why, he died 300 years ago." And Oisin thought, this old man is in his dotage. He doesn't know what he's saying. And he turned his horse and rode away from them, saying, "I'll go to my father's house." He went to the hill of Allen, and there was no sign of his father's house. There were mounds of grass grown up where the house had been. That was strange. He said, maybe my father gave up this place and built another house nearer to Tara, to be near the High King. So he turned his horse to ride toward Tara. Now at the foot of the hill, there was a quarry, and there were some men trying to lift a block of granite out of the quarry, and they couldn't manage it. Oisin watched them for a minute, and he said, "My, these men are weaklings. Why, a boy could have lifted that if my father were here." He rode over to them, and he leaned over their shoulders and picked up the block of granite and lifted it to the ground, while these men were standing with their mouths open in astonishment at this great hero, when his saddle girth broke, and he fell off the horse and landed flat on his back on Irish earth. Well, with that, his beauty disappeared, and he became a little shriveled old man. And Niamh's horse disappeared in a wisp of mist. The men were standing around him, and they said, "Who are you, and where did you come from, and what is this horrible transformation we have seen?" And he said, "I'm Oisin. I'm the son of Finn McCool, and I can't find him." And they said, "Of course you can't find him. He belonged to pagan Ireland, and Ireland is no longer pagan." They picked him up then, gently, And they took him to St. Patrick, who was in that part of the country. And when St. Patrick heard who he was, he sent for his secretaries. And he said, this old man was once the greatest poet in Ireland. And while he is alive, I want you to take down every word that he says. And the scribes sat by Oisin day and night and day, until he died. Patrick had many talks with him before he died, and he managed to get all of Oisin's poems down. And so now we have a record that will tell us the truth about Finn McCool and the Fianna. And this is only one of the stories that Oisin told, and when he told it, he was an old man with little sight and no hair and of no size and of very little life. This was in the very early years of the Christian era. She was the daughter of a slave girl and a very powerful druid whose name was Duvach. And for all that her mother was a slave and she was a girl child, her father was proud of her. He had his wise men come in to predict her future. And they looked at the wee thing lying there and they said, this is a child of fate. This child will grow up to meet her destiny, and she will hold within her hands one day the power that will destroy us, the Druids who are now so powerful. And one day she will shelter within her cloak the Lord of all creation. Well, when Duvach heard that, he was a little frightened. Not much, but enough so that he allowed the child more freedom than she would have had. Women in those days were not considered very important, and the children of slaves were of no importance. In fact, when Bridget's mother, who had become a Christian, having heard St. Patrick, began to lose her eyesight, Duvach sold her to another druid, but he kept Bridget. Now, she was a quiet little thing. She could stay so still that people would forget she was around. And since Duvach was rich and powerful and had a large household and a great strong dun to live in, travelers used to stop there. Men who came from all over the known world, and they would sit and talk about their travels. And Bridget would stay quiet. They'd forget she was around, and she'd listen to them and drink in everything they said, and then she'd go away by herself and dream about it. She did wonderful things in her life. She was the first one to insist that women should learn to read and write. She started school when she grew up, and she taught women. She even coaxed her father into buying her mother's freedom, blind as she was. Duvach heard people talking about this man, Patrick, and he said, who is he? Where does he come from? And he was told, he comes from Rome. But for all of that, he speaks Irish as though he were born here. And he walks as though he were a king, but he lives with the common folk. And he teaches them about God, a very different God from our Druidic gods. And Duvach would hear no talk of it. But Bridget listened. Her mother had taught her, too. When she was old enough to work, she was given the job of greeting strangers as they came in. And one day, she was only a wee girl at the time, a man came in and left his chariot outside the door, and Bridget began to talk to the charioteer. And he told her a long, sad tale about what a poor man he was, and she thought she'd like to give him a gift. And she went into the house, and the first thing that struck her eye was her father's sword, and it had a heavily jeweled hilt. And she took it and gave it to the charioteer. Her father was wild, but what could he do? The man had gone. And besides that, it was the custom to give gifts to strangers. Not quite such handsome ones, perhaps. She grew a little older, and she developed a great hand at making butter and cheese. And so she was given the job of running the buttery hatch. And she was good at it. They always had fine butter and good cheese in the house. But she had a generous heart, and anyone who came along and told her a tale of woe would be fed, and Duvok heard about it. And he came down to the dairy one day. He was furious, and she was sitting outside the door as calm as you please. And he said, "What's this I hear? You're giving away my food? I remember when you gave away my sword, and I was angry enough then, but now I'm more angry. How dare you give away my food? I'm going in here, and believe me, if you've given away my butter and cheese, you'll rue the day you ever did it." Bridget didn't care. She opened the door for him, and he walked in, and lo and behold you, the shelves were laden with bricks of butter. And in the middle of the floor there was a heap of silver cheese. It must have come from heaven, because she knew that she'd given away the last pat of butter. And her father said, "I've had enough of this. From now on, you'll mind the sheep out on the hill. And maybe the winds will blow some sense into your head." Bridget didn't mind. She liked being a shepherd. And every morning she would get up and go up the hill and let the sheep out of the fold and let them graze all day, from early morning until the sun was about to set. Well, now, if there's one thing about an Irish morning, it's this. It's cold. And she had an old blue ragged cloak that she wrapped about herself as she went up. But one particular morning, she started up the hill. The sun was just beginning to indicate that it was going to rise on the horizon. It was so dark that the corncrake, who cries only at night, was still yelling, and they make a very harsh noise. It was too early even for the larks, but Bridget started up the hill through the wet grass, because there's a kind of ground mist comes in Ireland. Oh, she was glad of her blue cloak, ragged as it was, and she wrapped it tight around herself as she started up the hill, because at the top of this hill there was a spring, and she always went there in the morning. She'd wash her face, and she'd say her prayers, because she didn't dare say them in her father's house. He just didn't approve. On this particular morning, as she was going up the hill, she saw a hawk poised, ready to pounce on something, and she hurried to see what creature might be in trouble. And she found one of her own lambs. He was stretched out in the wet grass, almost dead with the cold and fright, and she picked him up and rolled him in her shepherd's cloak, and turned to the bird and said, "I know you do no wrong. I know that you must hunt for food, but just this one day, let there be an end to this killing. Let there be peace." And the hawk flew away. And she walked on up the hill, and she heard a ewe bleating furiously, looking for her lamb, and she felt the wee lamb stir in her cloak. And she let him down and watched him run away, glad to find his mother and his breakfast. And on she went up to the top of the hill. Now, this was her own particular hill. No one was ever up there. And her spring was deep and still, and the only thing that she ever saw reflected in it, beside her own face, was the red from the berries of the rowan trees that grew next to it. And this morning, as she knelt and leaned over to wash her face, she jumped back in alarm, because there in the spring there was a girl's face. It was no one she knew. And she said, "Now, who can this be? And such eyes, I never saw such eyes. Well, they're like pools. I could drown myself in eyes like that, and she seems to be calling me. Who are you, woman in the well, and what do you want of me?" And with that, she looked up, and she wasn't by her spring at all. She wasn't even in Ireland. She was kneeling in a sea of sand. There was nothing visible all the way to the horizon except sand. And the sun was coming up over the horizon enough to let her see her way. And she stood up and she said, I wonder, am I dreaming? And then she remembered that once, years before, she had heard a traveler tell about this sea of sand that lay to the south. And he had said that there were trees that had leaves like swords that rattled in the wind. But she couldn't see even a tree. There was nothing but sand. She walked on because what else was there to do? And the sand seemed to resist her feet, to slip back 2 steps for every one that she went ahead. And then when the sun was up, full, it was very hot. She dropped her shepherd's cloak down and she let it drag behind her in the sand. And she wandered on as best she could. And after a while, she saw shapes on the horizon, but she was too far away to know what they were. She tried to hurry, and she couldn't hurry. But after a while, she made it out that they were men. But they didn't look like any people she had ever seen before. And all through the hot day, with the brassy sun shining on her, she followed them. And then, as night does in the desert, the darkness came suddenly, and it was cold again. Then she was glad of her shepherd's cloak. And those up ahead had lights, and she followed them. And then even the lights disappeared, and there was nothing left but the stars. She felt that she was completely lost. After a long time, she came to the gate of a town, and she felt her way through it. There wasn't a light, there wasn't a sound, except the stir of sleeping animals off to her left. Well, she was used to animals. So she made her way through another gate, and she found herself in the yard of a caravanserai. The animals were tethered there, and she made her way through them until she came to one of the stalls, and she knocked, thinking, please God, send me shelter, send me food, because she was destroyed with the hunger. After a long time, a man answered her knock, and in the flickering light of his little oil lamp, he saw this girl waiting, and he said, there's no room for you here. Indeed, you're not the first one I've turned away tonight. And poor Bridget, she didn't know what to do. She turned and made her way through the courtyard again, through the sleeping animals, out to the street. Well, the street seemed to rise, and of course she was used to hills, and she began to walk through the dark until she left the town behind her and found herself out on a hillside. And there was a great light that just suffused the whole hill, and it seemed to be coming from one spot. And she said, now, thank God, there must be shepherds, and I'm a shepherdess. They'll take care of me. And she made her way toward the source of this light, and when she came to it, she saw that it was a little sodded byre that had been cut out of the hillside to shelter animals. She went to the door, and she stopped dead in her tracks, because there, inside the doorway, was the girl whose face she had seen in the spring. She was sitting on a heap of straw, holding a new infant in her lap. And Bridget sank to her knees and said to her, who are you, and why did you call me here? And the girl spoke and said, my name is Mary, and this is my son, newborn in Bethlehem this night. And Bridget said, Mary, you look so tired. Give me the child, and do you lie back in the straw and see, can you get some rest? And with that, Mary handed the baby to her and stretched out in the straw and went to sleep. Bridget rocked the baby, and she saw that this light was coming from his head. And she knelt there rocking him until he went to sleep. And then she laid him in a manger that was full of clean straw and seemed to be ready for him. And again she knelt there, watching him, just dazed by this light. And after a while she heard a step, and she looked up. A man had come in, and he said, I'm Joseph. And she heard the question in his voice, and she said, My name is Bridget, and I've come from Ireland. Don't ask me how. But I feel that I've been called here to serve your son." And Joseph smiled and shook his head, and he said, "He's not my son, Bridget. He's my charge to care for while he has any need of me. For there's a mystery on this girl, my wife, this Mary, who is sleeping in the straw. God has made her mother of this child. This is the Prince of Peace, the Lord of all creation." And just then, the Lord of all creation woke up crying because the cold had found his bed, and Bridget lifted him and wrapped him in her ragged cloak and cradled to him until he slept again. And when he was asleep, she put him back. And all night, she kept her vigil. In the morning, when Mary wakened, refreshed, she sat up and said, "Bridget, your name is known in heaven, I'm sure, but from now on, your name in the mouths of men will be the foster mother of Christ." And Bridget looked up into those deep eyes again, and once again she felt herself drowning in those pools of compassion. And then she shook her head and found herself back on her own Irish hillside, kneeling beside her own spring, and there were the rowan trees. And she looked down the hill, and there were her sheep, huddling together in the dawn, with no one to guard them from the wolves. She jumped to her feet and started down the hill, and met her father coming up. And he stopped dead in his tracks, and he said, "Bridget, where have you been? You've been gone from Ireland for a year and more." And she said, "I don't know. I thought I was dreaming over my morning prayers." And then she told him about the sea of sand and Mary and Joseph and the Lord of all creation. And Duvok said, "That was no dream. That was your destiny. They told me when you were a little thing that this would come to be." And with that, he fell flat on his face before her. Well, she couldn't have her father prostrate in front of her. She bent over to raise him. And as she did, she noticed her shepherd's cloak. No longer was it faded and ragged, but now it was new and shining and heavily inwrought with jewels.